the most amusing part about working with the Galactic Science Council wasn't the ridiculous amount of safety protocols, or even their obsession with cataloging every possible way a species could die. No, it was watching their mandibles drop literally in some cases whenever a human did. Well, just about anything. Dr. Venthrix, the lead xenobiologist, had been particularly entertaining today. His crystalline eye stalks had been vibrating at such a high frequency that Professor Sarah Chen was genuinely concerned they might shatter. But honestly, who could blame him? It's not every day you watch a human casually stroll through what was supposed to be a lethal radiation zone while munching on a protein bar. This is impossible, Venthrix's translator squeaked, his voice climbing several octaves higher than its usual range. The radiation levels in testing zone alpha are at least 300 times the lethal threshold for any known sentient species. Sarah took another bite of her protein bar, making a mental note to complain to the manufacturer about the chalky aftertaste. Oh yeah, it's pretty spicy in here. Remind me to grab my radiation badge when we get back. HR is going to want the exposure reading for their monthly report. Behind the foot-thick transparent neutronium barrier, the assembled alien scientists representing 17 different species and 28 prestigious research institutions collectively lost their minds. Several of them were frantically checking their instruments, convinced they must be malfunctioning. A few were recording everything with such intensity that their data pads were starting to smoke. And at least one, a gaseous being from the Horsehead Nebula, had become so agitated that they'd started to ionize. But the protocol. This came from Dr. Meep Lork, the Council's chief safety officer. His protective environment suit was practically vibrating with distress. You can't just walk in there. There are 743 safety procedures for radiation exposure testing. Sarah paused mid-stride, turning back to face the observation window. Oh right, sorry about that. I forgot to fill out Form XR7 billion in triplicate, didn't I? My bad. She grinned and took another bite of her protein bar, knowing full well that her casual attitude was probably causing several aneurysms among the safety board members. The truth was, she'd been trying to tell them for weeks that this level of radiation, while certainly not healthy, wasn't immediately lethal to humans. But after the 15th risk assessment meeting and the 47th safety committee review, she'd decided that sometimes the best way to make a point was to just demonstrate. Fascinating. Professor Xylaxia, the quantum physicist, had recovered enough to start taking notes. The human cellular structure appears to be actively resisting the radiation damage. And is she actually digesting nutrients in there? Well, yeah, Sarah shrugged, brushing some radioactive dust off her lab coat. It's my lunch break. Multitasking, you know. The observation room erupted into chaos again. Several of the more sensitive species had to be escorted out when their stress indicators started flashing red. The remaining scientists were divided between furiously documenting everything and trying to figure out how to cite her for safety violations in at least 12 different jurisdictional systems. Sarah continued her casual stroll through the test chamber, occasionally stopping to take readings with her handheld scanner. The chamber itself was impressive, a massive concrete and lead-lined structure that had been specifically designed to contain and study the effects of various types of radiation. Today's test involved a particularly nasty cocktail of gamma rays and neutron radiation, the kind of stuff that would reduce most species to their component atoms in minutes. Hey, while I'm in here, she called out, anyone want me to check anything else? Might as well make the most of it since I've already violated about. She paused to count on her fingers, 70-3 safety protocols. Dr. Venthrix had finally recovered enough to speak coherently again, but how? The mathematical models clearly showed that exposure to this level of radiation would cause immediate cellular breakdown in any carbon-based life form. Sarah couldn't help but laugh. Yeah, about that. Turns out your models didn't account for something we like to call human stubbornness. Also, our cells are pretty good at repairs. Give me a few days and most of this damage will be fixed up. Though I might need to increase my antioxidant intake for a while. The gaseous scientist who had been ionizing earlier had finally pulled themselves together enough to form words. Are all humans this resilient? Oh, this is nothing, Sarah waved dismissively. Wait until I tell you about the guy who survived swimming in a nuclear reactor's spent fuel pool, or the researchers who used to test radioactive substances. Though we try not to do that anymore, HR gets really grumpy about it. The safety officer had apparently given up on protocol entirely and was now sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth while clutching his rulebook. Sarah felt a little bad about that, but sometimes science required breaking a few rules. and possibly a few fundamental assumptions about what was supposedly possible. "I'm getting some interesting readings from the corner over there," she said, pointing to where the radiation levels were highest. "Want me to go check it out?" No, came the collective scream from the observation room. "Your species," Professor Xylaxia said slowly, "evolved on a planet that regularly bombards you with radiation from your star, has multiple naturally occurring radioactive elements, and is constantly subjected to cosmic rays. And you just adapted to it." Sarah nodded, finishing the last bite of her protein bar. "Pretty much. Earth's fun like that. Though to be fair, this level of radiation isn't great for us either. I'll probably feel pretty lousy tomorrow, maybe throw up a few times. Nothing a weekend of rest and some good old human cellular repair won't fix, though." The implications of this were starting to dawn on the assembled scientists. If humans could walk through radiation that would kill most species instantly, what else could they survive? The research possibilities were endless and terrifying. "Oh, and by the way," Sarah added, pulling something from her pocket, "I brought some radiation-hardened sensors to calibrate against your readings. They're built to human specifications, so they actually work in these conditions. Want me to set them up while I'm in here?" The observation room had gone eerily quiet. Even the safety officer had stopped rocking. You brought unauthorized equipment into a controlled testing environment," Dr. Meeplork whispered, horrified. "Well, yeah, your sensors kept melting. How else were we supposed to get accurate readings?" Sarah was already setting up the devices, carefully positioning them at key points around the chamber. "Don't worry, I had them properly certified. By human standards, anyway." The phrase "human standards" caused another minor panic among the safety committee members. Sarah pretended not to notice. "There we go," she said cheerfully, checking the readings on her tablet. "Now we'll have some proper data to work with. The radiation levels are actually a bit higher than your estimates, by the way, probably because your sensors couldn't handle the full spectrum." Dr. Ventrix's eye stalks had started vibrating again. "Higher? But that would mean that your safety margins were way off?" Yeah, Sarah headed toward the chamber's exit, pausing to brush off some more radioactive dust. "Might want to update those protocols of yours. Oh, and speaking of protocols, anyone know where I can find Form XR7 billion? Might as well fill it out now, since I'm technically still in the test zone." The safety officer fainted. In the days that followed, the Galactic Science Council had to completely revise their understanding of radiation resistance in biological organisms. Several new categories had to be created just to classify human abilities, and the safety protocols underwent a major overhaul to include what they now called the human factor, a designation for phenomena that seemed to defy conventional scientific understanding but were routinely demonstrated by Earth's primary sentient species. Sarah's casual stroll through the radiation chamber became legendary in scientific circles, though it was often dismissed as exaggeration or myth by those who hadn't witnessed it. The video evidence was classified as potentially disturbing to sensitive species and required special clearance to view. As for Sarah, she did indeed feel pretty awful the next day, but true to her word, she was back at work after a weekend of rest, ready to challenge more fundamental assumptions about what was possible. She did, however, make one concession to the safety committee's concerns. She started filling out her paperwork in advance, though she still occasionally forgot when she felt the demonstrations would be more effective than the documentation. The incident also led to an interesting addition to the Galactic Science Council's official species classification system. Humans were given a unique designation: radiation-resistant deathworlders, handle with extreme caution, prone to ignoring safety protocols. Sarah had the classification framed and hung it in her office, right next to her collection of radiation badges, each one proudly displaying exposure levels that would have killed most other species in the galaxy. She did eventually submit that XR7 billion form, in duplicate, not triplicate, just to keep them on their toes. The story of Sarah's radioactive stroll might have remained just another peculiar footnote in the annals of human-alien scientific cooperation, if not for what happened 3 months later during the Gamma 9 incident. It started, as these things often do, with an alien bureaucrat making what they thought was a perfectly reasonable request. "Absolutely not," High Commissioner Bleepak stated firmly. All 4 of his appendages crossed in what his species considered an unassailable position of authority. "We cannot possibly approve testing of the new fusion containment systems without at least 17 preliminary safety reviews." Sarah, who had been expecting this response, just smiled. The kind of smile that made seasoned xenobiologists reach for their emergency evacuation protocols. With all due respect, Commissioner, she said, leaning forward in her chair, we don't have time for 17 reviews. The Gamma-9 station's reactor is showing signs of instability, and our containment solution needs to be implemented within the next 48 hours. Impossible, the Commissioner's scales flickered in agitation. The minimum testing period for new containment systems is 3 standard cycles. It's right here in the manual. He waved a datapad that was approximately the size and weight of a small coffee table. Yeah, about that. Sarah pulled up her own data on her significantly more portable tablet. According to our calculations, the station's current containment system will fail in approximately 47 hours and 23 minutes. Would you like to see the math? The Commissioner's scales went from agitated purple to alarmed chartreuse. But that would mean total reactor failure, yes, followed by a rather spectacular explosion that would probably make my little walk through the test chamber look like a sunbath. Sarah's smile hadn't wavered. Unless, of course, you let us implement our solution now. The next few minutes involved a lot of alien cursing, which Sarah's translator tactfully rendered as untranslatable bureaucratic objection, followed by some frantic calls to various safety boards and ethics committees. The human containment system hasn't been tested, one committee member shrieked through the holographic conference call. Oh, it's been tested, Sarah corrected cheerfully. Just not according to Galactic Council protocols. We humans have been using variations of this design for decades. But the radiation levels, another committee member began, are well within human tolerances, Sarah finished. In fact, I'll oversee the installation personally. The resulting silence was broken only by what sounded suspiciously like someone's anxiety regulation implant shorting out. You want to physically enter a failing fusion reactor's containment chamber. The Commissioner's translator seemed to be struggling to convey the proper level of horror in his voice. Well, someone's got to install the new system, Sarah shrugged. And since none of your species can survive the radiation levels, that someone is going to have to be me. Unless you'd prefer to wait for those 17 safety reviews and see what a station-sized fusion explosion looks like up close. 20 minutes and several medical emergencies among the safety board later, Sarah had her approval. Sort of. This is completely unprecedented. Dr. Meep Lork, who had finally recovered from his fainting spell months ago, was trailing behind her as she headed for the station's reactor section. There are no protocols for this, no safety guidelines, no precedent in any known scientific literature. Sure there are, Sarah said, checking her toolkit. They're called human protocols. Rule 1, if something's about to explode, fix it. Rule 2, try not to die while following Rule 1. Rule 3, paperwork can wait until after the crisis is over. The reactor chamber itself was impressive, a massive spherical structure that housed the station's fusion core. The warning signs posted on the entrance were even more impressive, written in 47 different languages and featuring pictograms that somehow managed to convey certain death in a universally understood way. Sarah took a moment to appreciate the artistry before bypassing the safety locks. You can't just. Dr. Meep Lork's voice had risen to a pitch that probably would have attracted spacefaring cetaceans if they were in an atmosphere. The safety interlocks. Already overridden them, Sarah called back. Already half through the first airlock. Don't worry, I used my emergency override codes. Totally legitimate. Mostly legitimate. Legitimate enough for government work anyway. The inside of the reactor chamber was beautiful, in a terrifying sort of way. The fusion core pulsed with a blue-white light that would have immediately cooked most organic beings. The failing containment field flickered occasionally, sending out bursts of radiation that made Sarah's sensors chirp in what she chose to interpret as enthusiasm rather than warning. Right then she muttered, pulling out her tools. Let's see what we've got here. The next 2 hours involved a lot of creative engineering, some mild radiation exposure, and what Sarah would later describe in her report as aggressive percussive maintenance when one of the new containment field generators didn't want to slot properly into place. The observation room had filled up with scientists, safety officers, and various administrative personnel, all watching with a mixture of horror and fascination as Sarah essentially performed surgery on an active fusion reactor. Several of them had to be treated for stress-related conditions when she actually stuck her hand into the containment field to adjust a connection. There, Sarah finally announced, stepping back to admire her work. New containment system is installed and running. Radiation levels are dropping, and the core instability is correcting itself. Crisis averted. She turned to give a thumbs up to the observation window, only to find that most of her audience had either fainted or gone into various species-specific shock responses. Tough crowd, she muttered, making her way back to the airlock. The debriefing afterward was interesting, to say the least. So let me understand this correctly, the commissioner said, reading from a report that was growing longer by the minute. You manually installed a new containment system, while exposed to radiation levels that exceed our instrument's maximum reading capabilities, using tools that weren't approved by any safety board, following a procedure that doesn't exist in any official manual. And saved the station and everyone on it, Sarah added helpfully. Don't forget that part. It's kind of important. The paperwork for this is going to take years, Dr. Meep Lork moaned from his corner, where he was clutching what appeared to be the entire station's safety manual like a security blanket. About that, Sarah said, pulling out her tablet again. I took the liberty of drafting a new set of emergency protocols for similar situations. I call it the Human Emergency Response Protocol, or HERP for short. HERP, someone squeaked. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Step 1, identify imminent catastrophic threat. Step 2, let humans handle it because we're basically radiation-proof compared to everyone else. Step 3, file paperwork later. I even made flowcharts. The resulting silence was broken only by the sound of Dr. Meep Lork's security blanket manual hitting the floor as he fainted again. In the end, the Galactic Science Council had to create an entirely new category of emergency protocols, officially titled Extreme Circumstances Requiring Human Intervention. Please try everything else first. Sarah's flowcharts were included as an appendix, though they had to add several pages of warnings and disclaimers. The incident did have one positive outcome. The council finally approved fast-track procedures for human-designed safety systems. They figured anything that could survive a human's idea of field testing was probably safe enough for general use. As for Sarah, she got a commendation for saving the station, a formal reprimand for violating approximately 300 safety protocols, and a new job title, Emergency Human Intervention Specialist. She had that framed too, right next to her species classification. She also started keeping a tally of how many safety officers fainted during her demonstrations. The current record stood at 12, though she was pretty sure she could beat that the next time someone needed a human to casually stroll through what they considered a lethal environment. After all, someone had to show the galaxy that sometimes the best safety protocol was having a radiation-resistant Deathworlder on speed dial. Dr. Meep Lork did eventually recover from his fainting spells, though he developed a nervous tic whenever anyone mentioned the word human in conjunction with emergency response. He also started carrying a portable fainting couch, just in case. Sarah considered that a win. The couch was actually quite comfortable for naps between radiation-soaked emergencies. Word of Sarah's exploits had spread through the galactic scientific community, like a particularly persistent strain of space-borne bacteria. Which was why, 6 months after the Gamma-9 incident, she wasn't entirely surprised to find herself face to tentacle with Admiral Crix, Thar of the Galactic Defense Fleet. Absolutely not, Sarah said, not even looking up from her tablet where she was playing what appeared to be a game involving radioactive cats. Whatever it is, the answer is no. The Admiral's tentacles writhed in what his species considered an expression of extreme urgency. But you haven't even heard the proposal. Let me guess, Sarah sighed, finally looking up. Something's about to explode. Nobody else can get near it because of radiation toxicity, dimensional instability, all of the above, and you need a human to fix it. The Admiral's tentacles stopped writhing, ... possibly. And it's probably classified as an extinction-level event if it's not fixed. ... maybe. And the paperwork hasn't been filed yet because there's no time. The Admiral's chromatophores flushed what Sarah had learned to recognize as embarrassed mauve. There might be some forms in progress. Sarah saved her game and stood up. Well, why didn't you say so? This sounds like fun. What are we blowing up? Or preventing from blowing up? Same difference, really. The situation, as it turned out, involved an experimental quantum drive that had decided to start existing in several dimensions simultaneously, none of which were particularly compatible with conventional matter. The fact that said drive was powering a research station containing 3,000 scientists and staff members made the situation slightly more urgent than usual. So let me get this straight, Sarah said, examining the holographic display of the rapidly destabilizing station. The quantum drive is basically trying to exist in 7 dimensions at once, generating enough radiation to cook a small moon, and the automated systems can't shut it down because they technically don't exist in the same reality as the drive anymore. That is a surprisingly accurate summary, the station's chief engineer, a being composed primarily of crystalline structures and anxiety, admitted. Cool. Hold my coffee. Sarah handed her mug to Dr. Meep Lork, who had been assigned as her official safety observer after the council decided that if they couldn't stop her, they might as well document her violations properly. You can't possibly be thinking of going in there. The crystal engineer's voice created sympathetic vibrations that made nearby equipment hum. The quantum fluctuations alone would tear apart most forms of matter. Good thing humans aren't most forms of matter, then Sarah grinned. Already suiting up in what the council laughingly called protective gear, it was mostly for show, and to keep Dr. Meep Lork from having another fainting spell. But the radiation someone started is about 3 times what I dealt with at Gamma 9. I might need an extra day off after this one. Sarah checked her tools, most of which she'd modified herself after the standard ones kept dissolving in high radiation environments. Besides, quantum uncertainty means there's technically a non-zero chance that this will work perfectly fine. There's also a non-zero chance you'll be scattered across 7 dimensions. The crystal engineer vibrated frantically. Yeah, but think how interesting the research papers would be if that happened. Sarah finished her preparations and headed for the quantum drive chamber. Someone make sure to take good notes. This'll make a great case study for the new HERP manual. The chamber itself was interesting. Reality seemed to be having trouble deciding exactly what shape it wanted to be, and the walls occasionally flickered into colors that shouldn't exist in this universe. The quantum drive in the center was surrounded by a corona of energy that looked like what might happen if a rainbow had a nervous breakdown. Right then, Sarah muttered, pulling out her quantum-stabilized tablet. Let's see what we're working with here. The next hour was a fascinating exercise in applied quantum mechanics, creative problem-solving, and what Sarah later described as percussive quantum realignment, when the drive refused to stay in just one dimension. The observation room had been unusually quiet, partly because everyone was too terrified to make a sound, and partly because sound wasn't propagating quite normally through the quantum fluctuations. Okay, good news and bad news. Sarah's voice crackled through the quantum static. Good news is, I've almost got the drive stabilized. Bad news is, it's going to take one more adjustment, and I'm going to have to reach directly into the quantum field to make it. That's impossible, someone shouted. The quantum field would instantly. They never finished the sentence because Sarah had already plunged her hand into the swirling vortex of quantum uncertainty. For a brief moment she existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously, which she later described as kind of like that time I tried the engineer's home-brewed coffee, but with more existential uncertainty. The quantum drive made a sound that couldn't technically exist in 3-dimensional space, and then everything snapped back to normal. Well, mostly normal. Sarah's hair was standing on end and seemed to be glowing slightly, and she could temporarily see in ultraviolet, but she considered these minor inconveniences. Drive stabilized, she announced cheerfully. Though I think I just proved several quantum theories and disproved a few others. Someone might want to write that down. The debriefing was memorable, mainly because Sarah had to keep shifting between dimensions to answer all the questions. So just to be clear, Admiral Krixthar said, his tentacles twitching nervously, you deliberately exposed yourself to a quantum field that should have scattered your atomic structure across multiple dimensions. Yep, used unauthorized tools to manipulate a highly classified piece of experimental technology. The authorized ones kept quantum tunneling into other universes, and temporarily existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. 8, actually. I found an extra one while I was in there. Pretty nice place, though the physics are a bit weird. Dr. Meep Lork, who had been doing surprisingly well up to this point, finally succumbed to tradition and fainted. His portable fainting couch proved its worth once again. The incident led to several interesting developments in quantum mechanics, 3 new branches of theoretical physics, and a substantial revision to the human emergency response protocols. They had to add a whole new section titled Quantum Uncertainties and Other Dimensional Anomalies, Human Intervention Only When Universe is at Stake. Sarah's species classification was updated to include quantum state uncertain and dimensional stability questionable. She had these addendums framed as well. The crystal engineer later published a groundbreaking paper on human quantum interactions, though the peer review process was complicated by the fact that several of the equations only worked if you read them in ultraviolet light. As for Sarah, she spent a week dealing with random dimensional shifts and occasionally glowing in the dark, but she considered it a small price to pay for the advancement of science. Plus, being able to see in ultraviolet came in handy during her next emergency response, but that's another story involving a solar flare, 3 escaped experimental organisms, and a very concerned ethics committee. Dr. Meep Lork started bringing a backup fainting couch, just in case. Sarah borrowed them both for naps between dimensions. And somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of the Galactic Science Council, a new regulation was quietly added to the books in case of dimensional emergency, quantum uncertainty, or radiation levels exceeding known physics. Call a human, preferably one with a high tolerance for paperwork and a low regard for conventional possibility. Sarah had that one frame too. She was running out of wall space, but she figured she could always borrow some from another dimension if needed. After all, what was the point of being a radiation-resistant, dimension-hopping Deathworlder if you couldn't bend reality a little bit now and then? Just remember to file the paperwork afterward. Eventually. Probably in this dimension. Maybe. The quantum uncertainty principle made bureaucracy so much more interesting.